accessible, and to that point, sociable. You know, what do we measure? So if we're not measuring how sociable that experience is, how joyful it is, how much that connects you to other people and to place, are we measuring the right things? So that always comes up as being key as to how we're going to say what a good active neighbourhood looks like. So I'm really pleased that we've got Anne and Anna from Transport for Greater Manchester, who I get the pleasure of working alongside, who are both in the Yet to Travel team and are going to talk to us a bit more from their perspective. Thank you. You want a more proper introduction. So Anna, well, you've got it there. Yes, yeah, Anna's project manager at Active Neighbourhoods, for Active Neighbourhoods, and Anne Clarke, is a cycling and walking evaluation officer who had lots of conversations about what we measure and what we don't measure.
So hello everyone, and firstly apologies if you're expecting Dom today. I'm his replacement, unfortunately he couldn't make it. So yeah, as mentioned, I'm the project manager for Active Neighbourhoods at Transport for Greater Manchester. And with Anne, we'll be doing a joint double act today to talk you through some of a response to the research. And I think first of all, just to start with, a huge thank you to Ian and Graham for all of your kind of work so far on this. And it's been really interesting, and it's kind of pushing us as kind of more of a transport planner engineering type things as to how we think about some of this stuff. So yeah, move on to the next slide. Just click. There we go. Okay, so first of all, kind of what is an active neighbourhood? I know there's a lot of nuance as well about whether active neighbourhood is actually the right word we should be using in this context. Obviously, down in London, quite a lot of low traffic neighbourhoods, we use the term active neighbourhoods, but again, I don't think it's perfect. I think there's probably other ones we could be looking at, but in a TfGM context, that's kind of what we go for at the moment. And how we define it is kind of one of the top things is we kind of strive this community-led. That's come out of quite a lot of this research, but actually achieving that, and are we getting the voice of the whole community, is still much more work can be done on that. Something that we're aiming for, and kind of one of this key aim, or the way we phrase it and frame it, is the idea of having kind of quieter, safer streets. But obviously within that, I think we probably need to be looking a bit larger and encompassing all of it. And then, so what we're measuring, what we're trying to do. So one of the things that we kind of, our main focus is about reducing speed and volume of the through traffic. Again, should this be the primary focus? Should it be more about actually that, maybe some of the second one or the third ones down, about attractive neighbourhoods, about greenery, etc. When you're telling the story, which is what's coming out of the research, is I think that's probably a question to us as to whether we're using the right kind of framing. And it's, so what I said is there, it's about improving greenery, it's about these additional things as well, or the central part, and it's about everyone get around more easily, safely, walking, cycling, wheeling, for those shorter journeys within the neighbourhood specifically. So I'll let Anne take over.
So what do we already have about active neighbourhoods in existing strategy and policy? So one of our overarching strategy documents is the 2040 transport strategy, which sets out what we want for transport in Greater Manchester to 2040. So it has vision, goals, target. One of the things that's in there that is relevant for active neighbourhoods, it has these spatial themes, which is where we think about where people are moving from and to. One of those spatial themes is connected neighbourhoods, so very much focused on neighbourhood level movement. It's got an emphasis on walking and cycling, reducing the impact of traffic on local roads, reducing collisions, and so on. And then, oh, that hasn't changed. There we go. And then sitting underneath that 2040 strategy, we also have the Streets for All strategy, which is the overarching framework for everything we do on the streets in Greater Manchester. So some of the key things in this strategy that are relevant for thinking about neighbourhood level movement and the neighbourhood, it's split up into 3 levels. So it looks at spatial planning, network planning, and then street design and management. Within the spatial planning, there's a real emphasis on developing the 15 to 20 minute neighbourhood idea. This is very much thinking about kind of development and what is happening where within areas. And then when thinking about the street design, it identifies different street types, one of which is active neighbourhoods as a street type. And again, yeah, active neighbourhoods should be pleasant places to live where it's easy to make local journeys and connections to public transport by walking and cycling.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, back to me again. So just to provide a little bit more context, won't dwell on this too much, but to say, you're probably all aware that we relatively recently had a new Transport Commissioner, Dame Sarah Story, and one of her the foundations, what she's really keen on and what the focus will be going forward is this, this idea of accessibility. So bringing that more front and centre to all of the work we do, which is good because that's echoed obviously with some of the research findings about behaviour change and this community involvement and engagement that again is something we're all working on to try and achieve, but how best can we do that and achieve that is kind of what we discussed today. So obviously we look at the priorities here that set out recently in the idea of refresh the mission. One of the key things is the idea of infrastructure delivery, and then there's two images here which is taken from the kind of launch article, and that is specific, you can't see it very clearly, but specific references to active neighbourhoods. So they'll be one of the kind of key pillars of stuff we're looking to develop in the future, and that Dame Sarah Story is particularly keen on and sees them as part of the solution to this overall vision for Greater Manchester. And so just to go into a little bit more detail into the specifics of the active neighbourhood programme within Transport for Greater Manchester. So we've got an image here, I'm just going to describe it. It's of Courier Lane, which is a scheme in Tameside that actually that went in as part of the emergency active travel scheme during COVID, and it has an older individual who now finds it much easier to walk in that environment with the reduced traffic. So just to briefly say is that most of this is funded through something called the Mayor's Challenge Fund, which is 160 million. It's not all for active neighbourhoods, unfortunately. Very small percentage of it is, but that's just it's part of this wider package of schemes to improve active travel within Greater Manchester. And there's two different, it's always a little bit confusing people, but there's two different programmes within the Mayor's Challenge Fund. Some of it is district-led, so districts have come to us and said, we want to create an active neighbourhood in this area because it's been long held by the community, etc. There's another piece of work, a programme that's very much kind of both them together, which was run, centrally commissioned at the beginning with ourselves and the commissioning partners, consultants, Arup and Sustrans. And this is looking at how can we really involve the community, do things a little bit differently to how we've done it before, and follow quite an in-depth process to develop these schemes. Because obviously we find when we get further down the line, we want them to be what the community wants, an engagement from the start. So there's a little bit of a different way for us doing it. And just to also say that they're usually implemented as a trial. We find that's the most effective way is to do a 6-month trial to really get buy-in from the community. And also that is part of the consultation, that the scheme is not a done deal, it's to do what works, and then if things don't work, to move them. Before any permanent scheme, we spend significant amounts of money on a permanent scheme and infrastructure, and it really helps us kind of have a bit more scope to test things out. And just to say that there's lots of different active neighbourhoods within Greater Manchester that have been developed at the moment. They're all at various different stages. So Ian referred to a few of them in his presentation. Some of them are permanent schemes, some of them are just being developed. They're all funded through slightly different pots within sort of thing. And at the moment there's a few that are going to trial. So. And then this is just to say, it's actually a slide from Arup, from James, people may have seen before, is that this is the kind of co-design that we've been trying to do on this centrally led, and it's really starting with the community, bopping up, what do they want to see, how can we engage, what have we wanted for the area, what's the aspirations. So apologies, the image is quite small, there's a lot on there, but it basically all this is saying is that there's a number of different stages that we go through before we even get to a plan that we then go out and consult with. The issue is, how do you get that engagement right at the start? because we often find that once you've got an actual plan and a map and a drawing, that's when the engagement, you know, people say, oh, I haven't heard of anything before that. And it's right at that start that we want people to be more involved and get that participation number up, rather than, oh, a filter's going outside my house, this is the first I've heard of it. So it's I think what we need to work on is right at the start getting at high levels. We do see some quite high levels, so just on some of them we've got it's between about 50% and 5% in the neighbourhoods that we've done, depending on the size of the neighbourhood usually, which is higher than you'd expect on you know, a normal consultation process. But yet again, still once you get to the stage 4, we've got a plan. We do find some people say, this is the first I've heard of it, so it's how can we work, how can we do that and engage different types of people. And these are just, I won't dwell on this, these are just example schemes. So just basically just a very illustrative quick overview, that these are some of the schemes that have been developed as part of the Arab Commission, that have been out to public consultation, and they are not purely just, you know, a filter point here. We are trying to look in the round at things. So what greening can we do? What plantings can we do? What is needed to make a whole neighbourhood area? But yeah, these are all in various different stages at the moment, but have been out to the public. And then I think this is just, you know, in response to the research, to the findings that Ian's been saying. And I think what's interesting is how we're actually defining the areas and how we're starting right at the beginning, because I think we do go from quite an engineering approach of these are our boundary roads, and then what fits nicely within a nice, you know, geographical area. But what's coming out from the research was much more about thinking about the amenities, thinking about these, like, you know, the idea of third space, the services, the community spaces, you know, the centrality of green spaces as well and how they're used. And I think maybe as planners and engineers, we're sometimes a little bit, oh, like these are the boundary roads, we're trying to stop rat running this area, so this is the box that we're going for. But obviously I think this research very much challenges that, and we need to keep on thinking about that and challenge ourselves, to be honest. And then obviously this leads to the idea of this social interaction and being a part of a community, and that's important in our framing, rather than looking at from more an engineering perspective of roads and signs.
I want to share a bit of analysis that one of our partners done that's quite relevant in terms of this aspect of things. So the Sustrans Walking and Cycling Index, they did some analysis using GIS data, looking at where existing types of amenities and services are in relation to households across the whole of Greater Manchester. So they've based it on it being within 800 metres distance of a household. So I know what Ian's discussed a bit earlier is like, is that a suitable like distance for everyone, which is like something to think about. But as a starting point in terms of understanding potentially Greater Manchester's potential for active neighbourhoods from the perspective of accessing those different services and amenities that people want to, it's quite a useful starting point. And we can see across different types of amenities, so things like food shop, park or recreation space, schools, doctor's surgeries, and then various other things, including public transport access. We've got quite a range of levels, with the lowest being the railway station or Metrolink stop at 30% within that distance for people, but then up to 98% for park space and recreational space. So reflecting on what the research is telling us so far in terms of what we need to have accessible neighbourhoods, and thinking particularly about transport and the ways that people move around. So Ian touched on what role cycling has for people and how it's kind of perceived currently. And I think something that really stood out for us is like the potential lack of opportunity, particularly around things like people might have a local bike shop, but it's unlikely that that's going to have non-standard cycles which might be suitable for them, which makes it a lot more difficult for them to access compared to people that could just go to any old bike shop. Also things like modelling of behaviour and having suitable role models, and actually like getting people, seeing people that feel familiar to them, that they connect with, so that they actually start thinking like maybe cycling is something that they could do. Then moving on to the mobility, really that emphasis on getting the basics right. And it's a real mixture of kind of maintenance, enforcement, all these issues. Some are kind of temporary, some are more kind of things like if things start wearing out or whatever. So it's kind of, you feel like it should be easy because they're like kind of basics, but actually in practice to actually deal with them is quite challenging, and it requires working with a lot of different partners. So kind of thinking about how we take that forward. And then thinking about the role of cars and how it's this kind of split, how they're like, on the one hand, they're very necessary for access and all the things around, whether it's people coming to people or people using them to access amenities and services that they can't access in their local area. But balancing that with the research has shown that cars have this really bad effect on people's mobility and being able to get out, things like the speed of traffic, the volume of traffic, not being able to cross roads. So yeah, there's lots to reflect on in terms of like what the role of the car is in future neighbourhoods. I also wanted to reflect on some of the things that we know from other bits of research that really chime with some of what's come out of the work that Ian and Graham have been doing so far. So I had a look through some of the research that ourselves and partners have done that cover some of these themes as well. So we know from these that, for example, older people are less likely to agree that the network encourages them to walk or cycle. They're less likely to think that cycle safety in their local area is good, and they're less likely to be satisfied with the condition of pavements. Likewise, disabled people are less likely to feel welcome and comfortable walking, wheeling, or spending time on the streets of their neighbourhood. They're less likely to be satisfied with daytime personal security or safety from traffic when walking or wheeling. And they're also less likely to be satisfied with walking infrastructure provision and management. And that last point relates specifically to frequent wheelchair users, which is how that research framed that in paper.
And so just to kind of briefly go over some of the things that I think that, you know, really kind of pulled out from the research and that we need to be thinking about moving forward, and and how we can do things differently. So there's obviously a lot about engagement and about how the best way to engage with different communities and different groups. There was an interesting idea about citizen assemblies, so we maybe need to do a bit more research on that as to how we can pull that in. Again, it's always this balance of resource, time, pressure, but it shouldn't be used as an excuse. I think there's still a lot more we can do. And I know, yeah, certainly for districts, under a lot of pressure to get stuff and the financial implications. But I think there's a lot of actual, really concrete suggestions about practical things we can do, which we need to be looking into and taking this forward, how we can do it. So I guess it's also about being mindful of the very vocal minority, and they are exceptionally vocal on that neighbourhoods. I would say they really do like to get their point across, as anyone who's worked on them will know. So it's being mindful of that and framing it within the context of broader consultations and results, and teasing out those quieter voices. And maybe a part of that is engaging with different groups. Again, it's going back to these kind of points that are always coming out time and time again about local ownership of schemes and buy-in. So, we've tried building on the work of ARP and Sustrans about doing things a little bit differently to how we do it, a highway scheme, really coming led from the community. But there's still more work to done with, certain demographics and how to get them engaged right at the beginning. And the voice of the whole community. I think that's a very fair point about some of the consultation material and how consultations run, and them being fully inclusive. I think there's a lot of work to be done on that front. Interesting about businesses. So as part of the work we did with ARP and Sustrans, we did engage with the businesses, sometimes specifically. But again, they seem to be quite central to neighbourhoods and how people see them. So more targeted specifically at businesses. I think is something that will be great to do. And then kind of this is building on points previously about kind of collaborative design, working with kind of a bottom-up approach. And then this idea of framing, actually, I know Louise in the room is particularly keen on, and I completely agree with her about this. The idea of maybe reducing the focus on this narrative of, you know, reducing car dependency, but actually selling the vision, selling what we're doing. You know, all the benefits it will bring, rather than it being this dichotomy between you need to reduce car travel, active travel is, you know, essential, because for a lot of these groups, as the research says, sometimes cars do play a certain role, and it needs to not be such a you and them and yeah, adversarial, I think, in the way we're framing it sometimes. And that is it from us.
Thank you. It's great to see how I think things have evolved from when it used to be just described as an engineering problem to recognising it really isn't just an engineering problem, and the level of kind of emotional and social intelligence that needs to go into creating a good, active neighbourhood. And then to that point, I think your last point was, you know, where you started as well about language. Yeah, so Louise, one of my colleagues in the middle here for Greater Sport, and doing some work very much about how we think about being very intentional about our language and our framing and public narrative. And just, you know, from low traffic neighbourhoods to active neighbourhoods to, if you go to different parts of the country, open streets, quiet streets, safer streets, you know, how do we get to a language that actually resonates with people and that doesn't censor cars or censor what you're taking away? And we've got a job to do on that one. And I think then another part of that is just that point as well of it's so much more, isn't it, than in the design of making it for you, you know, and to our next point really, it's how do you do that in your language, in your imagery? How's all of it appeal to people where we're living in an ageist society? We're living in a society that immediately thinks about economics as people that are, you know, independent, are able-bodied, generally of a particular gender and background. So when we look at those stats for kind of neighbourhoods and how far away of amenities, it'd be really interesting to see, is that going to trajectory kind of decrease? So actually people are going to be further away from some of those amenities. How different that looks across Greater Manchester, where we know there's all those spatial inequalities, and how different that looks if you are disabled or you are older, and actually how many of those amenities genuinely cater for you. And I think generally you'd say you're probably going to have to travel further a lot of the time before you can access somewhere that feels like it's inclusive, accessible for you. So all those wider kind of inequities that are designed, unfortunately, into our neighbourhoods that make this, you know, so key that we get it right. So thank you. And really pleased, our last presentation. So from one Eve to another Eve. So Eve Blizzard, who's another research fellow here at University of Salford.